Welcome to Bankruptcy, Through the Looking Glass, with Barry Levine.
Hello and welcome to Through the Looking Glass with Barry Levine. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and in today's episode, we're tackling a topic that's becoming more and more common, tax debt and the difficult decisions many individuals face when dealing with overwhelming liabilities. As usual, we're joined by bankruptcy expert Barry Levine, who will help us explore the crossroads where tax debt and bankruptcy intersect. Barry, welcome back.
You flatter me. Nice to be here, of course. Hey, tax debt, that's,
Listen, I got to keep you coming back somehow, right?
Go ahead, ask
All
away.
right.
We offer murders for hire. That's a good way to get out of tax debt, but,
I thought we were going to talk about that off the record, Barry.
The record, that's right. You forget. I'm old. I forget about these things.
How common is it for individuals to be facing significant tax debt in today's economic climate?
Nowadays, I'll say unfortunately, I guess, is very common. I mean, people I represent often have not filed returns for years,
Wow.
and again, looking at anything from a bankruptcy point of view, under certain circumstances, you can discharge income taxes in a bankruptcy. General rule of thumb is more than 3 years due if you file the return on time and all this other stuff. But when you don't file returns, they never become non-dischargeable. And what eventually happens, I mean, I have a case, if I mentioned the case where the kid has 1,800 Bitcoin and he's in a chapter 7, but this is America, but he hasn't filed tax returns for 5 or 6 years prior to his filing of his case. And, what happens is that the IRS, they file estimated returns. They put all the information together. Sometimes it's beneficial, sometimes it isn't, but, the fact of people not filing returns or filing returns without a check, which is even more common to a certain extent, is very prevalent nowadays. Again, I speak just of Massachusetts, as I tell clients, if you have to owe any taxing authority, you're better off owing the IRS than the Mass Department of Revenue, because the state here is more aggressive than the IRS.
What are some of the most common reasons that you find people end up in this overwhelming tax debt?
There are a number of people who don't like to pay, they're self-employed, don't like to pay quarterly taxes. So what happens is that, come April 15th, if you're a high earner, suddenly you're scrambling around for X number of dollars to, pay your tax liability. There are people who either, for some reason, they under withhold or over withhold, and it results in a liability sometimes one way or the other. And, again, it just happens. I mean, that doesn't take into account the folks who, we've spoken before about, small businesses, closely held businesses. One of the easiest cash flows to tap into is the withholding taxes that you take from employees and ostensibly pay over to the government. But, nobody's standing there with a gun making sure you pay the money to the government.
Right.
And, when those taxes, as opposed to income taxes, those are considered what they call trust fund taxes. They're non-dischargeable. So those, when the IRS files a tax lien against you, the two things, they have a statute of limitations, a collection statute, which I think is either 6 or 10 years. And when they file a tax lien, their tax liens are good for 10 years. And you'd be surprised as how many people wait out the 10 years.
Wow. Yeah, you get yourself into some serious trouble in a situation like that.
And bankruptcies, it may hold off collection activities. Again, the automatic stay applies to the IRS and the Mass Department of Revenue and any other taxing authority the same way it applies to a creditor or a bank. But at a certain point in time, the only way to deal with the taxes is, you either make yourself scarce and time passes, or
Go underground.
It has been known to happen. Or you do what's called, an offer to the IRS. It's an offer in compromise. And you say, hey, I owe you X number of dollars, which never in a million years are you going to collect. And you offer them some smaller amount. You may have seen those ads on TV. They're a little more realistic. but getting off on pennies on the dollar, that's a little questionable. But, how the IRS looks at it is they look at the liquidation value. In fact, you can go online. They have a little offer and compromise calculator that you can fill out all the numbers yourself.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I do heart surgery that way. I go to the website and in the back alley, I'm doing surgeries. No biggie.
Hey, everyone's got to have a side hustle, Barry.
Listen, I don't have a diploma on the wall in my office. Nobody has to see my medical degree. So,
You seem legit.
Getting back to offers and compromise. So they look at two things: the liquidation value of your assets. And if you own a home and you owe this and own that, this little thing tells you what they calculate. I think they estimate the liquidation value of real estate at 65% or something like that. And then the second thing they factor in is what they can hope to collect from you over 6 years. And then that's where it sort of ties into bankruptcy, because the standards, the standards we use for Chapter 7s or Chapter 13s, the income and expenses and all this other mishigas, that's based on IRS statistics. So they look at what your income and expenses are, and they determine, what your surplus is. So those two things would be the amount of your offer.
You mentioned asset liquidation. Can you talk a little bit more about what role that plays in resolving tax debts, and how do you determine when that's a necessary step for your clients?
Well, I tell you something, it's in a business sense more so than in a personal sense. I mean,
okay.
I've been doing this over 44 years now, and in my experience, only one time has the IRS, the taxing authorities have a lot of good press. People are fearful of dealing with the tax man.
Of course, yeah, it's always been that way, right?
Hey, wasn't that Beatles song, The Taxman?
Yeah, I remember.
Now I'm dating myself.
I know it too, so.
Oh, okay, we can sing it together. And so they have very good press, but reality is, in my 44 plus years, only one time have they actually looked to sell a piece of property because of a tax liability. And I think that was like 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So most people fear what they're going to do. Their reality is, 9 times out of 10, you're dealing with a computer. You can tell that whatever notice you receive is from their 800 number. And I tell, my advice to clients is that when either the revenue officer shows up at your door and leaves a card inside, or calls you and leaves a message, they always leave their badge numbers. Remember that's the time to do something, because until it goes from the computer to a person, you're dealing with nothing. I mean, I have, I always tell stories. I have a client now who was married, and his husband, somehow he filed a tax return for the two of them. And somehow 2 years later, it resulted in a $65,000 tax liability.
What?
Hasn't been explained yet, but somehow that's what occurred.
That's not a small number.
No, it's not. And my client, the liability will be dischargeable, I think, in August. And we're just, waiting out the tax man until August. And time passes, and he'll be able to file a bankruptcy and get rid of it.
So you just got to wait it out.
Lots of times, I mean, the only time you really have to be concerned is when, like I said, when you're dealing with an individual. They'll send you notices that they're going to levy on your assets and all this other stuff. What does it mean? Again, getting back to being a cynic, it's sort of meaningless.
Yeah. When like, in what situations do you recommend bankruptcy versus, trying, like you said, to send that letter of, hey, I'm going to pay you this much? Like, how do you evaluate what the best course of action is?
It's usually a two-step. I mean, most of these people who owe money to the IRS that need to go through the offer and compromise process usually have other debt. So the way to go about it, the way I go about it, is we file a Chapter 7, if that's in the cards. They discharge all their dischargeable debt. And then once they've gotten their discharge, and, if the IRS starts getting aggressive, we do an offer and compromise. But then we're only dealing with what they have then, as opposed to the extraneous debt.
And what are some of the pros and cons of going the bankruptcy route when it comes to resolving tax debt?
The only pro would be, to the extent if it's dischargeable, would be, again, to file your bankruptcy so you can discharge the taxes. I have a nifty little program here that I can run their tax transcripts through, and it tells me actually when the taxes will be dischargeable. And if it's let's say 6 months from now, we can, waiting to file a bankruptcy, if there's nothing in the nature of an emergency, a foreclosure or this or that, waiting 6 months, time passes, it's really not that big a deal. So if we can wait 6 months and then we file and the taxes is discharged, we go about it that way. I look at the offering compromise if in your situation, if you can't or there are taxes that are non-dischargeable, and you don't want to live the rest of your life with the threat of the IRS coming in. Whether they're going to do it or not, that remains to be seen. But just, want to be able to open up a bank account and not worry that they're going to hit your account for $1,000 or however much money you can afford to lose. Or if you buy stock, they're not going to look to levy on your stock interests and shit like that because you owe taxes. That's the, and if you don't mind living like, with your head under the sand, then it doesn't matter at all.
Again, going underground.
It's there are lots of people out there like that, and things like that could matter. They don't care.
Yeah.
I reached that point in my life. It's like, well, what's anybody going to do to me at my age, right?
But you pay your taxes, Barry.
All the time. Are we on the record? No.
When people come to you, is it more like they're in years of trouble typically?
It's usually several years of taxes that are due. Between the stories about CPAs who, and my father used to say CPA stood for constant pain in the ass, or the taxpayer themselves. It's one. If I said Bubba Miser, it's one story after another. Like the guy with the Bitcoin, his CPA is did his taxes that were due, all the returns from 2020 to 2024. But he's arguing about a 2014 tax return. And as a result, the poor kid hasn't been able to show that his returns have been filed. So, it's usually one thing or another, people. And then once you haven't filed your returns, as was told to me one time by, I think it was a revenue officer, if you haven't filed your returns, the best thing to do is to file them around April 15th when they're inundated with tax returns.
Right.
So now yours is just one of the crowd, as opposed to this, that, you decide on December 12th to file your return. So, you need to be smart about that sort of stuff too. And then, I once had a client who hadn't filed his federal returns in, had been 10 or 12 years.
Wow.
And the IRS wound up filing estimated returns for him, which he ultimately accepted because their estimated returns were probably, he felt, better than his return. So
hey, you got to weigh, right? You got to weigh the option.
Hey, you can't blame him.
No.
You got to do what you got to do. It's all, when you get down to it, it's all like a battle. It's like, if you think the revenue offices, and I don't mean to disparage them, I've dealt with a lot of nice ones. They're very pleasant, but they're trained. They're like prosecutors, they're trained. I remember the story. There was a guy was eating dinner. He worked for the IRS up in New Hampshire, and he saw in some little dive diner, there was a Rolls Royce parked there. Piqued his curiosity. What would a Rolls Royce? Up in New Hampshire, most of the cars are on blocks. So what would a Rolls Royce be doing up there? He did a little research. He uncovered a whole financial irregular. Don't ask what he found. They were defrauding the government. I don't. It's a long time ago, but it was a whole story. All because he said, "What the hell is a Rolls Royce doing here?" I once had a client who thought he was smart. He used to cash, I don't know what the limit is anymore. If you cash a check for more than $10,000 or deposit it, it gets reported to the IRS. So what he used to do was he had his customers write him checks for just under 10,000, 9,200. 9,400, and he would go to their banks and cash it. I never realized IRS agents carry guns when they came to visit me about it.
Oh, wow. So you're saying that you can't do that?
Well, people, the thing is, they used to be, in my crazy younger days, my wife and I had a sailboat. Don't ask. And there was a guy who wrote about sailing in the Boston Globe. I forget what his name. I think it was Tony Chamberlain. And he said that there were watchers when you were on your boat. If you were doing the most ridiculous thing that you could conceivably think of, there would be somebody watching what you were doing. And that's what it is. People don't realize there's always somebody watching.
Yeah.
I mean, I tell stories. There was a guy when I was younger and worked for somebody. He's the only person, he borrowed money from the SBA and he bought a limited edition Corvette. He went to jail. Why? Because he ran pharmacies and he used to take pharmaceuticals, Schedule II, and things that you can't sell, and walk them out the back door. He thought nobody was watching. He looked very good on film.
Awesome stuff, Barry. Well, thanks for tuning in to Through the Looking Glass with Barry Levine. To connect with Barry, head to levineslaw.com. And please like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review. Barry, I always love your stories.
I forgot I was going to sign off by saying Zygazook.
Oh, that's right, Zygazook. I forgot about that. Remind us, what does that mean again?
That means go in good health.
Go in good health. Zygazook, everybody. Thanks, Barry.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.